News of the pool showdown, as it was immediately dubbed, spread through Oak Ridge Heights faster than if it had been announced on a billboard. By Sunday morning, Michael found a plate of homemade cookies on his porch with a note. "Welcome to the neighborhood. Don't mind Linda. She tried to have my wind chimes classified as noise pollution." Diane from number 42. Throughout the day, neighbors Michael had never met happened to be walking by his house. Instead of the cold shoulders he'd experienced since moving in, they stopped to introduce themselves, offering tools, muscle, and hilariously similar stories. She measured the height of my Halloween decorations with a laser level. She reported my bird feeder as an unauthorized wildlife feeding station. She left a note saying my Christmas lights were visible from space and disrupting migratory birds. Sarah from across the street confessed that several neighbors had wanted to bring welcome gifts when Michael moved in, but Linda had told everyone the neighborhood had strict rules about unauthorized welcoming committees, and that newcomers needed to earn their place before being socially integrated. By the following weekend, the pool was gone, and Michael had started transforming the space into the backyard oasis he'd always wanted. When Dave arrived with a truckload of pavers donated by a construction site where his friend worked, 3 other neighbors showed up with shovels and wheelbarrows. 2 weeks later, the transformation was complete: an attractive patio with string lights, potted plants, a fire pit, and comfortable outdoor furniture. Michael celebrated with what he called a small thank you gathering that quickly became the largest social event the street had seen in years. Even Officer Rodriguez stopped by off-duty with his family, bringing homemade salsa and admiring the transformation. "Much better than that tetanus trap," he laughed. "Though I'm going to miss our weekly calls from you-know-who." The gathering evolved into something deeper as neighbors realized how disconnected they'd become. Many admitted they'd begun avoiding community interaction altogether, rather than dealing with Linda's self-appointed authority. The impromptu block party became an unofficial neighborhood meeting where residents discussed actual community concerns and ways to work together. From across the street, they could see Linda's curtains twitching. She had declined Michael's polite invitation, delivered with witnesses present, claiming she had important documentation to organize. Throughout the evening, they spotted her driving by at decreasing speeds, taking photos from her car. By the end of the night, the neighbors had formed a legitimate neighborhood association, not to police each other's property choices, but to organize block parties, coordinate yard sales, and establish a support network. Diane was elected president, and Michael, despite his protests about being too new, was named social coordinator. Over the following months, the street transformed. Front porch gatherings replaced suspicious curtain peeping. Children played between yards without fear of being reported for unauthorized lawn crossing. 3 more above-ground pools mysteriously disappeared, replaced by gathering spaces. Most surprisingly, Linda's approach began to shift. It started small. Her usual documentation clipboard was seen less frequently. Then neighbors reported receiving curt nods instead of suspicious glares. When Michael organized a neighborhood yard sale, Linda participated from her driveway, though she insisted on measuring her display tables to ensure they were exactly the same distance from the curb as everyone else's. The turning point came during a severe thunderstorm that caused a power outage. As neighbors gathered to check on each other, Michael spotted Linda standing uncertainly on her porch, grabbing an extra flashlight. He walked over and invited her to join the group sheltering in Diane's garage, where a generator kept basic lights and coffee going. After a moment's hesitation, she accepted. 6 months after the infamous pool incident, Michael hosted another barbecue. As he watched neighbors chatting and children playing, he caught sight of Linda cautiously offering her homemade potato salad to the buffet table. She still carried her notebook, but now it contained contact information for the city's best service providers and emergency contacts for elderly neighbors. Michael never regretted his decision to remove that eyesore of a pool. What had begun as a simple home improvement project had inadvertently drained something far more toxic than stagnant pool water, the isolation that had allowed one person's controlling behavior to divide an entire community. In its place, something much more valuable had formed: genuine connection, that made Oak Ridge Heights finally feel like home. For the next hour, Linda conducted what could only be described as a one-woman siege of Michael's yard. She paced along the property line like a general surveying a battlefield, making loud phone calls on speaker mode to what sounded like every government agency in the state. Michael and Dave could hear fragments of increasingly dramatic accusations. Yes, that's right, gallons of potentially toxic chemicals. No barriers at all. Children could wander right in. I've been keeping meticulous records, possibly operating heavy machinery without a license. At one point, Linda disappeared only to return wearing a wide-brimmed hat and armed with a lawn chair, bottled water, and binoculars, settling in for what appeared to be a long-term surveillance operation. She took photos whenever they moved. The camera shut a sound effect on her phone set to maximum volume. Does she realize we can hear her? Dave whispered as they worked. She just told the county she suspects we found Native American artifacts and are destroying them. Michael was about to respond when the unmistakable sound of sirens approached. His stomach dropped as a police cruiser pulled up, followed immediately by a second. His new mortgage, his clean record, his professional reputation, all flashed before his eyes. The last thing he needed was trouble with local law enforcement before he'd even hosted his first barbecue. Linda practically skipped to meet the officers, her notebook flapping open as she gesticulated toward the half-dismantled pool with the urgency of someone reporting a prison break. Officer Rodriguez, according to his nameplate, approached Michael while his partner, Officer Jameson, spoke with Linda. Rodriguez was a stocky man with kind eyes that contradicted his professional poker face. "Sir, we received multiple calls about unauthorized construction work, environmental hazards, noise ordinance violations, and," he checked his notes, eyebrow raised, "the possible destruction of historical artifacts." Michael wiped his hands on his jeans, painfully aware of how suspicious he might look covered in pool grime. "Officer, I can explain everything." He retrieved a folder from his garage containing his property deed, printouts of city ordinances, and records of his calls to the municipal offices. "I'm just removing my own above-ground pool that's become a safety hazard." Dave, who had stopped working when the police arrived, added, "We're being careful with the drainage too, directing it toward his garden area over there, not into storm drains. We've got a filtration set up to catch any debris." In the background, Linda's voice rose to new heights as she apparently detected this betrayal of actual responsible behavior. "Well, of course, they'd say that. They probably set that up when they saw me calling. I have photos from earlier." The men had barely started draining the swamp-like water when a voice sharp enough to cut glass sliced through AC/DC's thunderstruck. "Excuse me, what exactly do you think you're doing?" Michael turned to see Linda Hoffman power-walking across his lawn in blinding white tennis shoes, her perfectly geometric bald haircut remaining eerily motionless despite her rapid movement. She clutched a leather-bound notebook that Michael had seen her consulting while measuring the height of his grass with an actual ruler last week. After moving in, he'd already endured her lectures about his non-traditional mailbox color, standard navy blue, and received a typed notice when his trash cans remained at the curb until 7:05 p.m. on collection day. "Morning, Linda," Michael said, forcing brightness into his voice while Dave muttered something under his breath. "Just finally getting rid of this death trap." Linda's nostrils flared as she pulled herself up to her full 5'3" height. "Do you have written permission from the Homeowners Association? Architectural approval? A demolition permit?" She began furiously scribbling in her notebook. "You can't just make changes to property appearance without proper authorization. There are procedures." Michael held up his phone. "Actually, I checked thoroughly. According to my closing documents and the county records I accessed, our neighborhood doesn't have an active HOA. It dissolved in 2015 when not enough residents paid dues." The veins in Linda's temple visibly pulsed as her face flushed crimson. "Well, that's simply incorrect. And even if there were no official HOA, you still need neighborhood consensus for something this disruptive. I'm sure there are environmental regulations about draining pool water. What about the chemicals? The ecosystem? The children? She gestured wildly toward the street where no children were present. Dave snorted, accidentally knocking over a bucket and sending a small wave of murky water toward Linda's immaculate white shoes. She jumped back with a gasp that could have summoned dolphins. Listen, I've done my homework, Michael explained, showing her the city website on his phone. No permits needed, and I'm draining the water responsibly onto my own property, away from the storm drains. Linda's eyes narrowed to slits as she pulled out her phone and began photographing everything. Michael, Dave, the pool, their tools, even the license plates on their vehicles. This isn't over, not by a long shot. I'm calling the authorities, all of them. Officer Rodriguez flipped through Michael's documents, occasionally nodding. He walked the perimeter of the pool area, inspecting the drainage setup with professional interest. Meanwhile, Linda had cornered Officer Jameson, her notebook now fully deployed, as she read from what appeared to be a manifesto of neighborhood violations, dating back to Michael's moving day. After a thorough examination, Rodriguez returned to where Linda was mid-rant about the precedent this sets for anarchic home improvements. He cleared his throat. Ms. Hoffman, I've reviewed the situation and the documentation. The homeowner is well within his rights to remove his own pool. There is, in fact, no active HOA in this neighborhood with authority to prevent this action, and he's following proper procedures for water drainage. Linda's mouth opened and closed several times like a fish suddenly finding itself on land. But what about the noise? The ELESO, the potential catastrophe impact on property values. I've lived here for 17 years and never. Officer Jameson, a younger officer with the patient expression of someone who regularly dealt with similar situations, couldn't suppress a small chuckle. Ma'am, removing an old broken pool is likely to improve property values, not hurt them. And it's 11 a.m. on a Saturday, well within noise ordinance hours. They're not even using power tools yet. There must be some regulation being violated. Linda insisted, furiously flipping through her notebook as if the answer might materialize on the next page. What about heritage preservation? This neighborhood was built in 1992. The officers exchanged glances, Officer Rodriguez biting his lower lip while Officer Jameson suddenly became very interested in adjusting his radio. Both were clearly struggling not to laugh outright. Ma'am, Officer Rodriguez finally said with the measured tone of someone choosing his words carefully, he doesn't need anyone's permission to remove his own pool. This is a civil matter at best, and from what we can see, everything is being done properly. In fact, he added, glancing at the rusty structure, from a public safety perspective, removing this hazard is commendable. Linda's face went through a rainbow of colors before settling on an alarming shade of purple. This is outrageous. I'm going to call the mayor, and the newspaper, and my nephew who's PRE law. As she stormed off toward her house, Officer Jameson took Michael aside while Rodriguez returned to their vehicle. Sorry about this, sir. We actually get calls from Ms. Hoffman about 3 times a week. Last month, she reported her next-door neighbor for suspicious leaf-raking activities. He handed Michael a card. You're doing nothing wrong. Feel free to continue your project. If she returns and becomes disruptive, give us a call. And, oh, he lowered his voice, fighting a smile. Good luck with the pool. My brother removed one last year. Margaritas on the new patio taste way better than pool maintenance fees. Michael Parker wiped sweat from his brow as he stared at the monstrosity in his backyard. A once luxurious above-ground pool, now resembling an abandoned spacecraft crash site. After saving for 5 years to buy his first home in Oak Ridge Heights, this eyesore hadn't been mentioned in the glossy real estate photos. The previous owners had conveniently forgotten to disclose that the pool's blue vinyl liner was now a patchwork of duct tape over tears. The metal frame had rusted to the color of dried blood, and the filter system made sounds like a dying robot whenever he tried to run it. That thing's a mosquito palace, remarked his neighbor Tom from over the fence. Last summer, the Johnson's kid almost fell through the rotted decking. Lucky he didn't break his neck. After 3 quotes from pool repair companies, each more heart-stopping than the last, Michael made his decision. The pool wasn't just hurting his property value, It was becoming a neighborhood liability. He'd already caught teenagers trying to sneak in one night, despite the water being a murky soup of leaves and possibly tetanus. When Michael first moved into the neighborhood 3 months ago, he'd been charmed by the neat rows of houses with their manicured lawns and friendly-seeming neighbors. Oak Ridge Heights had seemed like the perfect place to put down roots after years of apartment living. The house itself, a modest 3-bedroom ranch with good bones and a spacious yard, had been at the upper limit of his budget, but the location made it worth the stretch. What the real estate agent had casually described as a backyard water feature turned out to be a 24-foot diameter above-ground pool that looked like it had last seen maintenance during the Bush administration, the first push. The winter had been particularly harsh, with heavy snowfall that had partially collapsed one section of the pool wall. Now that spring had arrived, the melted snow had mixed with the remnants of last summer's water to create what Michael had begun referring to as the swamp of despair. His homeowner's insurance agent had been blunt during her inspection visit last week. Either fix it properly or remove it entirely, she'd said, snapping photos. Otherwise, I can't guarantee coverage if somebody gets injured. And trust me, these things are attractive nuisances, especially to neighborhood kids and drunken adults. Michael had spent his evenings that week watching pool renovation videos online, calculating costs and weighing options. New liner, $800. Replacement frame parts, $1,200. Professional repairs, $3,500 minimum. Complete removal, $1,800 if he hired professionals, or about $300 in disposal fees if he did the work himself with help. On a crisp Saturday morning that promised perfect demolition weather, Michael cranked up his Destruction Day playlist, heavy on AC/DC and Metallica, and welcomed his brother-in-law Dave, who pulled up in his battered pickup truck right on time. Dave, a former construction worker built like a refrigerator with forearms thick as Christmas hams, arrived with a truck bed full of tools and a cooler of beer for after. Ready to commit poolicide, Dave called out, already pulling work gloves from his back pocket. I brought the reciprocating saw, the bolt cutters, and those heavy-duty contractor bags you asked for. Michael had spent the previous week meticulously researching local ordinances, making 3 calls to city planning, and even chatting with the building inspector he'd fortuitously met at the hardware store. All confirmed what he'd already discovered online. No permits were needed to remove an above-ground pool on his own property, especially one this size. He'd printed out copies of the relevant regulations, just in case, and had a detailed plan for properly draining the water into his yard's lowest section, where he eventually wanted to create a rain garden. Let's do this, Michael said, lifting his coffee mug in a toast. By sunset, this backyard hazard will be nothing but a memory and a pile of scrap metal.